The story of Samson and Delilah is one of the most intriguing and enigmatic in the Bible. Why did Delilah, the woman who seemed to love Samson, decide to betray him so cruelly? Was it just greed, fear, or something even deeper? Before we understand the betrayal, we need to go back to the beginning, to Samson's birth, to understand the magnitude of his mission and the weight of his calling. Israel was living through oppressive times under Philistine rule, a people known for their military strength and cruelty. In the midst of this bleak scenario, God chose Samson to be Israel's deliverer. From before his birth, Samson was consecrated to God as a Nazirite, a vow that required him not to cut his hair, not to touch unclean things, and to abstain from wine. These rules were not just symbolic, they were the spiritual link that gave Samson his supernatural strength. From a young age, Samson showed signs of his divine strength. He killed a lion with his bare hands, defeated entire armies single-handedly, and performed impressive feats that intimidated his enemies. But despite his physical strength, Samson carried inner weaknesses that made him vulnerable. He was impulsive, overconfident in his abilities, and often let his heart lead him into dangerous situations. It was in this context that Delilah came into his life. Delilah, a woman from the valley of Sorek, seemed to be the answer to Samson's emotional longings. She didn't just see him as a warrior, she seemed to treat him like a man, someone who needed comfort and affection. Samson, used to being feared and revered, gave in to Delilah's seduction. But did she really love him? Or was there a bigger plan at work? The Philistine leaders, desperate to destroy Samson, saw Delilah as the perfect weapon. They offered her a fortune in silver to discover the secret of his strength. For Delilah, this offer was tempting. But was it only for the money? Perhaps Delilah felt pressured, fearing the consequences if she didn't cooperate. Or perhaps she saw Samson as an opportunity to guarantee her security and position. Delilah's approach was meticulous. She didn't pressure Samson immediately. First, she won his trust by being affectionate and understanding. When she realized that he was in love, she began to ask subtle questions. "Samson, where does your strength come from? Is there anything that could weaken you?" At first, Samson treated the questions as a joke. He gave false answers, saying that he would be weakened if he were tied up with new ropes or fresh bowstrings. But every time Delilah tested these claims, Samson proved that he was still invincible. However, Delilah was persistent. Using emotional manipulation, tears, and accusations of lack of love, she gradually wore Samson down. He resisted as long as he could, but Delilah knew how to target his weaknesses. She played on his need to be understood and loved, creating an atmosphere of trust that was actually a trap. Finally, Samson gave in. In a moment of vulnerability, he revealed his greatest secret. His strength came from his vow with God, symbolized by his never-cut hair. Without his hair, he would be like any other man. Delilah, now with the answer the Philistines wanted, waited until Samson was sound asleep. In the dead of night, she called a man to cut off Samson's 7 braids. And with that, Samson's connection with God was broken. When the Philistines came in to capture him, Samson tried to fight back, but his strength was gone. He was easily subdued, arrested, and taken to Gaza, where he would be publicly humiliated. Delilah, who seemed to have been his ally, was responsible for his downfall. But Delilah's betrayal was only the beginning. While Samson was being taken captive, the invincible man was now facing his greatest battle, the one within himself. Something began to change, and what seemed like the end became the beginning of an unexpected journey of redemption. Get ready to explore how he found strength in weakness, and how his story culminated in an epic and life-changing outcome. Samson's capture was a triumph for the Philistines. They had finally defeated the man who had terrorized their people for years. To ensure that he would never pose a threat again, they gouged out his eyes, a brutal and symbolic act. They wanted not only to weaken him physically, but also to humiliate him by depriving him of the sight that once inspired fear in his enemies. Samson, now blind and in chains, was taken to Gaza, where he was forced to work as a slave, turning a millstone, a task meant for animals. The man who once destroyed armies single-handedly was now reduced to impotence. But what the Philistines didn't realize was that Samson's true strength was never just in his muscles or his hair, but in his connection with God. And while his captors celebrated his downfall, something was changing. In the silence and darkness, Samson began to reflect on his life. For the first time, without the applause of the people or the shouts of his enemies, he turned completely to God. There in that mill, he realized that he had been arrogant, relying more on his strength than on the divine presence that sustained him. His time in captivity was a painful but necessary lesson. Without light, he began to see more clearly than ever. Meanwhile, his hair began to grow again. For the Philistines, this meant nothing. For them, Samson was finished. But for Samson, every strand of hair that grew was a reminder of the covenant he had broken and the strength that God could restore. The Philistines, on the other hand, were elated. They decided to organize a great celebration in the temple of Dagon, their god, to commemorate Samson's capture. The temple was packed. The Philistine leaders, along with thousands of citizens, laughed and toasted, sure that their victory was final. And, as if to add to the humiliation, they ordered Samson to be taken to the temple to entertain the crowd. Samson was led by a young servant to the center of the temple. He was stumbling, blind and weak, but there was something inside him that the Philistines couldn't see, a rekindled flame of determination. While the crowd laughed and jeered, Samson began to pray silently. But this time, his prayer was not arrogant, nor was it a plea for personal glory. It was a humble plea, a cry of repentance. "Lord Jehovah," he prayed, "remember me. Give me strength once again, so that I may fulfill the purpose for which I was called." Samson asked the young servant to position him between the two main columns of the temple. With his hands touching the stones, he felt the structure that supported the whole building. And then something extraordinary happened. The strength he thought he had lost forever returned, not as before, but even more powerful. He took a deep breath and, with all his soul, pushed the columns with everything he had. The temple began to shake. Small cracks appeared in the columns and spread throughout the structure. The crowd's laughter gave way to panic as the ground shook beneath their feet. In one last cry, Samson cried out, "May I die with the Philistines." And with one final push, the pillars collapsed. The entire temple came crashing down, destroying everything and everyone inside. Thousands of Philistines, including their leaders, died that day. It was a victory that changed the course of Israel's history. And in the center of the rubble was the body of Samson, who gave his life to fulfill his final mission. But this story is about more than the fall of a strong man. It's about redemption, purpose, and God's incredible ability to use our weaknesses to accomplish something great. Samson, even in his failure, found strength in his humility and trust in God. And Delilah? Her betrayal was the spark that led to this epic conclusion, but her true motivation remains a mystery. Samson's sacrifice was not just to defeat his enemies, but to show that, even in our lowest moments, God can use us for something extraordinary. After all, Samson's strength was never his own, it was always God's. Now let's dive into the profound lessons of this story and reflect on how the challenges faced by Samson still resonate in our lives today. Get ready to discover the transformative impact of this journey and how it can inspire our faith. After the temple collapsed, the echo of Samson's sacrifice reverberated among the Israelites. News of the destruction of Dagon's temple and the death of thousands of Philistine leaders, including their rulers, quickly spread. For the people of Israel, it was a moment of hope in the midst of oppression. The one who had been a fallen hero rose again as a symbol of redemption and victory, even in his death. But the impact of this story goes beyond its tragic conclusion. It teaches us profound truths about character, faith, and the dangers of our choices. The story of Samson and Delilah is, above all, a reminder that even the strongest have weaknesses. Samson, for all his physical strength and skill in battle, was vulnerable to emotional and spiritual traps. His weakness was in his heart, in his desire for love and acceptance. Delilah, on the other hand, symbolizes the temptations that often mask dark intentions under the appearance of beauty and comfort. But why did Delilah do what she did? The Bible doesn't give us a direct answer, but it does offer us clues. The Philistine leaders offered her a fortune in silver to discover the secret of Samson's strength. This certainly reveals a greedy side, but was it just that? Perhaps she also felt afraid. After all, the Philistines were known for their cruelty. Refusing such a critical mission could mean her own death. Or perhaps she saw Samson as a threat not only to the Philistines, but also to her own safety and independence. Whatever her motivation, Delilah knew how to manipulate Samson. She used her beauty, charm, and calculated patience to win his trust. Delilah represents something deeper, the way temptations can creep into our lives, not abruptly, but through a series of small compromises. Just as Samson ignored the warning signs and gradually gave in, many of us can also be drawn into spiritual traps when we neglect our vigilance. On the other hand, Samson teaches us that even the greatest heroes can fall, but they can also rise. His journey is a reflection of our own struggle with pride, sin, and redemption. During his life, he often used his strength for personal ends, but in his death, he surrendered everything to God. This final act was more than an act of strength, it was an act of faith. Samson understood, perhaps too late, that his true strength had always been in God, and not in himself. However, one question remains: why did God choose Samson, with all his faults, to be a deliverer? The answer lies in God's nature. He often chooses the unlikely, the imperfect, to carry out his plans. This reminds us that no matter how imperfect we are, God can use us for greater purposes than we can imagine. The story of Samson and Delilah also invites us to reflect on our own lives. Which Delilahs are we letting into our hearts? What temptations are we ignoring or underestimating? And how can we reconnect with God's purpose for us? In the silence of captivity, Samson rediscovered his faith. He realized that, even though he had failed, God was still with him. This shows us that, no matter how far we have fallen, God's grace is always within our reach. It's a powerful reminder that our identity lies not in our failings, but in who God calls us to be. What about Delilah? Her betrayal made her an infamous figure, but it also warns us about the dangers of compromising values for personal interests. Her story challenges us to evaluate our own motivations and to consider the impact of our choices on others. As we approach the outcome of this story, one last thought echoes: Samson, blind and humiliated, found redemption by trusting in God again. And what about us? Are we ready to abandon our weaknesses and trust in Him, even when all seems lost? Now we come to the most striking point of this story. Get ready to discover how Samson's life and sacrifice continue to resonate today, challenging us to find purpose even in our weaknesses and to live with the strength that comes from true faith. As Samson was led to the temple of Dagon, the Philistine god, he seemed just a defeated, blind, and humiliated man, led like a trophy to the delight of his enemies. But something was about to change. In the midst of that crowd of mockers, under the weight of humiliation and chains, Samson found a connection he had lost long ago: his faith. In the temple, the deafening noise of the celebrations reverberated. The place was packed with thousands of people, including the most important leaders of the Philistines. They were there to celebrate not only their victory over Samson, but what they believed to be the supremacy of their God over the God of Israel. The atmosphere was oppressive, with the sound of drums and mocking laughter filling the air. But in Samson's heart, a silence settled, something that no one could perceive. He asked the young servant who was leading him, "Put me where I can touch the pillars that support the temple, so that I can lean on them." The request seemed innocent, perhaps even pathetic in the eyes of the Philistines, but for Samson, it was strategic. He felt the cold columns under his calloused hands. Every crack in the stone seemed to tell a story. And it was there, in that moment of total vulnerability, that he said his last prayer. "Sovereign Lord, remember me. O God, give me strength once again, so that I may take revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." This prayer was not just a request for revenge. It was a cry for redemption. Samson recognized his failure, his past arrogance, and his disconnection from God's purpose. Now blind and humiliated, he understood that his true strength had never come from his braids, but from God's presence in his life. The party in the temple continued, oblivious to what was about to happen. The people laughed, toasted, and the dancing intensified. But Samson's hands began to press against the pillars with renewed force. He took a deep breath, feeling an energy that seemed impossible for someone in his condition. It was as if the force that had abandoned him was returning, not just to fulfill its mission, but to do something that would echo for eternity. With a shout that silenced the crowd, Samson said, "May I die with the Philistines." The columns began to give way. The sound of the stones moving turned the laughter into screams of panic. The vibration of the walls was followed by visible cracks, and in a moment of sheer devastation, the entire temple collapsed. Dust rose like a cloud, engulfing everything and everyone. Thousands of Philistines, including their leaders, perished that day. And in the midst of the rubble, Samson's body lay. He had sacrificed his life to fulfill the purpose for which he had been called from his mother's womb. Samson's story ends with a sacrifice that brings liberation to the people of Israel. But more than that, it is a testimony to God's transforming power. Even at the lowest point in his life, when there seemed to be no hope, Samson found redemption and purpose. His final strength came not from his hands, but from his faith. This story challenges us to reflect. How many times have we strayed from God's purpose because of pride, selfishness, or wrong choices? And how often do we forget that, even in our darkest moments, there is a chance to start again? Samson reminds us that God can use even our failures for something great. And now, a question. Was Delilah just a piece in God's bigger plan to bring Samson to this moment of redemption? Or was her betrayal simply the result of her own choices and weaknesses? This story is not just about strength and weakness, but about God's power to transform even the most difficult moments into eternal victories. If you liked this story, leave a comment with your opinion. And don't forget to watch the next video, where we'll explore another impressive narrative from the Bible. Subscribe to the channel and share this message with someone who needs to hear about the strength that comes from true faith.